Captain Marcus Thompson stood at attention outside the grand palace gates, his polished uniform gleaming under the morning sun. For 15 years, he had served as the head of the royal guard, protecting the monarchy with unwavering loyalty. His weathered face bore the scars of countless battles, each mark a testament to his dedication to the crown. The palace buzzed with unusual activity that morning. Servants hurried through the corridors, their faces etched with worry. Something was different, something that made Marcus's instincts prickle with unease. He had learned to trust these feelings over the years, and today they screamed danger. Inside the palace, King Edward sat in his private study, reviewing documents that would change the kingdom forever. The economic reforms he planned to announce would redistribute wealth from the noble families to the common people. Schools would be built in every village, hospitals would treat the poor without payment, and land would be given to farmers who had worked it for generations without owning it. The king knew his decision would create enemies among the powerful elite who had grown rich while the people suffered. But his conscience could no longer bear the sight of children begging in the streets while nobles lived in luxury. He had seen enough of his people's pain during his recent travels through the countryside, disguised as a common merchant. Marcus received word that several high-ranking nobles had requested an urgent meeting with the king. Lord Rothwell, Duke Harrison, and Countess Victoria had arrived together, their faces grim and determined. These were not social calls, Marcus realized. These were the kingdom's wealthiest citizens, and they rarely agreed on anything unless their own interests were threatened. As the nobles entered the throne room, Marcus positioned his guards strategically around the palace. Something in their manner suggested this meeting would not end pleasantly. He had served long enough to recognize the signs of brewing rebellion among the aristocracy. The conversation behind the closed doors grew heated quickly. Through the thick walls, Marcus could hear raised voices, though the words remained unclear. Lord Rothwell's booming voice dominated the discussion, while the king's responses became shorter and more clipped with each exchange. Outside the palace walls, crowds began to gather. Word of the king's planned reforms had leaked somehow, spreading through the common quarters like wildfire. Farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers stood together, many carrying signs supporting their beloved monarch. They had heard rumors that the nobles planned to oppose the changes, and they had come to show their support for the king, who finally listened to their struggles. Marcus watched the growing crowd with concern. While he supported the people's right to peaceful assembly, he knew that large gatherings could quickly turn dangerous if tensions escalated. He sent word to increase patrols around the palace perimeter and ordered his men to remain calm but vigilant. Inside the throne room, the confrontation reached its peak. Lord Rothwell slammed his fist on the ornate table, his face red with anger. The reforms would cost him millions in lost profits from his factories, where workers labored for barely enough to survive. Duke Harrison worried about losing his vast land holdings, while Countess Victoria feared the end of her family's mining empire, built on the backs of desperate workers. The king remained unmoved by their threats and pleas. He had made his decision after months of careful consideration and consultation with advisors who truly cared about the kingdom's welfare. The reforms would proceed as planned, with or without the nobles' approval. As the meeting concluded with no resolution, the nobles stormed from the throne room, their faces dark with fury. Marcus intercepted them in the grand hallway, noting their aggressive postures and whispered conversations. Lord Rothwell glared at the captain with undisguised hatred, knowing that Marcus's loyalty to the crown made him an obstacle to their plans. The afternoon brought disturbing reports from Marcus's intelligence network. Several noble families had been quietly moving gold and valuables from their estates, suggesting they were preparing for something significant. Private security forces, employed by the wealthy, had been spotted gathering in unusual numbers outside the capital city. Marcus immediately requested an audience with the king to share his concerns. The monarch listened carefully to the captain's report, his expression growing more serious with each detail. While King Edward had expected opposition to his reforms, he had not anticipated the level of organization among his opponents. Evening fell over the kingdom as both sides prepared for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation. The common people remained gathered outside the palace, their numbers growing as news of the nobles' threats spread. They sang traditional, songs and shared stories of hardship, united in their hope for a better future under their king's new policies. In the noble quarters of the city, a very different scene unfolded. Secret meetings took place behind closed doors as the wealthy elite planned their response to what they saw as an attack on their way of life. Messages were sent to allies in neighboring kingdoms, and plans were made to undermine the king's authority through any means necessary. Marcus spent the night reviewing security protocols and positioning his guards for maximum effectiveness. He knew that his royal guard, though well-trained and loyal, numbered only in the hundreds. If the nobles decided to use force, they could potentially field thousands of private soldiers and hired mercenaries. The captain's wife, Sarah, brought him dinner in his office as he worked late into the night. She could see the worry in his eyes, though he tried to hide it behind his professional demeanor. After 20 years of marriage, she knew when her husband faced something that truly frightened him. As midnight approached, Marcus made his final rounds of the palace grounds. The crowds of supporters had thinned but not disappeared entirely. Many had set up small camps, determined to stay and protect their king through the night. Their dedication moved the captain, reminding him why he had chosen to serve the crown in the first place. Unknown to Marcus and the king, the nobles' plans were already in motion. Secret messages had been sent to military commanders who owed their positions to noble patronage rather than royal appointment. Gold had changed hands, and promises of future rewards had been made to those willing to betray their oaths of loyalty to the crown. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the very foundations of the kingdom. On one side stood a king, determined to help his people, supported by common citizens and protected by a loyal but outnumbered royal guard. On the other side gathered the kingdom's wealthiest and most powerful families, backed by private armies and corrupt military officials. Dawn would bring the beginning of a struggle that would determine whether justice and compassion could triumph over greed and tradition, or whether the old ways would crush any hope of change for the suffering masses. The first rays of sunlight painted the palace walls golden as Captain Marcus received the news that would change everything. His Lieutenant James burst into the command post with sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The young officer had ridden hard through the night, bringing intelligence that made Marcus's blood run cold. 3 battalions of the kingdom's regular army were marching toward the capital, but they were not coming to protect the king. These soldiers, numbering nearly 2,000 men, had been secretly recruited by the noble coalition. Their commanders had been bought with promises of land grants and noble titles once the current monarchy was removed from power. Marcus stared at the map spread across his desk, calculating distances and timing. The approaching forces would reach the palace by midday, giving him only hours to prepare for what appeared to be an inevitable siege. His royal guard consisted of just 400 men, all highly trained but vastly outnumbered by the approaching army. The king received the news with remarkable calm, though Marcus could see the pain in his eyes. King Edward had served alongside some of these military commanders during his younger years, fighting together to defend the kingdom against foreign invaders. The betrayal cut deep, but it did not shake his resolve to help his people. Word of the approaching army spread quickly through the crowds of supporters still gathered outside the palace. Instead of fleeing in terror as expected, their numbers actually grew. Farmers arrived carrying pitchforks and hunting bows, while blacksmiths brought hammers and whatever weapons they could forge quickly. Even elderly citizens hobbled forward, determined to stand with their king despite their physical limitations. Marcus watched this display of loyalty with mixed emotions. While he was moved by their dedication, he knew that untrained civilians would stand little chance against professional soldiers. He faced an impossible choice between accepting their help and potentially watching them die, or sending them away and facing the approaching army with his small force alone. The captain called an emergency meeting with his senior officers in the palace war room. These were men he had served with for years, warriors who had proven their courage in countless battles. Their faces reflected the same grim determination that Marcus felt in his own heart as they discussed their limited options. Lieutenant, James suggested abandoning the palace and evacuating the king to a secure location in the countryside. From there, they could organize resistance and potentially rally loyal forces from other regions. It was a practical suggestion that would save lives, but Marcus knew the king would never agree to abandon his people in their hour of need. Colonel Rivera, The eldest of Marcus's officers proposed a different strategy. They could use the palace's ancient fortifications to their advantage, forcing the approaching army into a costly siege. The thick walls and narrow passages would neutralize some of the enemy's numerical advantage, giving the defenders a fighting chance to hold until help arrived. But what help could they expect? Marcus's intelligence network reported that noble influence had spread throughout the military hierarchy. Many units remained loyal to the crown, but they were scattered across the kingdom and would take weeks to reach the capital. The royal guard would have to hold alone against overwhelming odds. As the morning progressed, the palace became a hive of activity. Marcus organized his men into defensive positions, placing his best marksmen in the towers and positioning reserves at key choke points throughout the complex. Every door was barricaded, every window fortified, and every corridor prepared for battle. The king insisted on addressing the crowds of supporters personally, despite Marcus's concerns for his safety. Standing on the palace balcony where his father and grandfather had once spoken to their people, King Edward's voice carried clearly across the assembled masses. He thanked them for their loyalty and urged them to return to their homes and families rather than risk their lives in the coming battle. But the people refused to leave. An old farmer named Thomas stepped forward, his weathered hands gripping a rusty sword that had belonged to his grandfather. In a voice cracked with age but strong with conviction, he declared that they had waited generations for a king who truly cared about their welfare. They would not abandon him now when he needed them most. Marcus realized that turning away these volunteers would be both impossible and potentially disastrous for morale. Instead, he began organizing them into support roles. Those with hunting experience were given positions as scouts and messengers, while others were assigned to help with supplies and medical care. It was not an ideal solution, but it was better than leaving them to fight without any coordination. The approaching army made no attempt at stealth as it drew closer to the capital. Their banners flew proudly, displaying the crests of the noble families funding this rebellion. At their head rode General Patterson, a man Marcus had once considered a friend and fellow protector of the realm. The sight of Patterson leading troops against his own king felt like a personal betrayal. Inside the palace, final preparations continued at a frantic pace. The royal treasury was secured, important documents were hidden, and evacuation routes were prepared in case the defenses failed. The king's personal effects were packed, though he had already stated his intention to remain in the palace regardless of the outcome. The queen, normally a picture of grace and composure, worked alongside the servants to prepare medical supplies and food for the defenders. Her presence provided comfort to everyone in the palace, from the highest-ranking officers to the newest recruits. She had insisted on staying despite the danger, declaring that a queen's place was beside her husband in times of crisis. Marcus took a moment to write a letter to his wife Sarah, knowing it might be his last communication with her. He described his love for his family and his pride in serving a king worthy of such sacrifice. The letter was sealed and given to a trusted messenger with instructions to deliver it only if the palace fell. The sound of approaching drums echoed across the city as the rebel army drew near. Citizens who had not joined the supporters at the palace barricaded themselves in their homes, uncertain of what the day would bring. Some feared for their safety if the rebellion succeeded, while others worried about the consequences of supporting the wrong side. From his position in the palace's highest tower, Marcus could now see the approaching forces with his spyglass. They moved with professional precision, their equipment gleaming in the sunlight. These were not rabble or mercenaries, but trained soldiers who had sworn oaths to defend the kingdom. The fact that they now marched against their rightful king made the situation even more tragic. The rebel army halted just outside the palace grounds, their formation spreading across the main plaza like a dark tide. General Patterson rode forward under a flag of truce, his face showing no emotion as he approached the gates where Marcus waited to receive him. The two men faced each other across the iron bars that separated loyalty from betrayal. Patterson's voice was steady as he delivered the rebels' ultimatum. The king must abdicate immediately and cancel all planned reforms, or face the consequences of defying the will of the kingdom's most powerful families. Marcus's response was equally calm and infinitely more dignified. He informed the general that King Edward would never abandon his people or surrender his crown to those who sought to oppress the innocent. The royal guard would defend their rightful monarch to the last man. and history would remember who stood for justice when the kingdom faced its darkest hour. As Patterson rode back to his forces, both sides prepared for battle. The die had been cast, and there could be no turning back from the confrontation that would determine the fate of the kingdom and all who lived within its borders. The palace gates groaned under the weight of the first assault as General Patterson's forces launched their attack. Marcus had positioned his most experienced soldiers along the outer walls, their crossbows and rifles creating deadly fields of fire across the approaches. The sound of battle echoed through the morning air, mixing with the cries of wounded men and the clash of steel against stone. From his command position in the central courtyard, Marcus coordinated the defense with calm precision, despite the chaos surrounding him. Years of military experience had taught him that panic was more dangerous than any enemy weapon. His voice carried clearly above the din of battle, as he issued orders to reinforce weak points and redistribute ammunition where needed most. The attacking forces had superior numbers, but the palace's ancient defenses proved their worth once again. Narrow passages forced the rebels to advance in small groups, where Marcus's men could engage them on more equal terms. The thick stone walls absorbed the impact of cannon fire, though dust and debris rained down with each explosion. King Edward refused to remain in the safety of his private chambers during the battle. Against Marcus's strong objections, the monarch insisted on visiting each defensive position to encourage his loyal defenders. The sight of their king sharing their danger boosted the morale of every man on the walls, even as it increased Marcus's worries about royal safety. The first wave of attacks continued for 2 hours before General Patterson ordered a temporary withdrawal. His forces had suffered heavier casualties than expected, and the palace defenses remained largely intact. Marcus used this respite to check on his wounded men and redistribute his remaining ammunition, knowing that subsequent attacks would likely be even more intense. Among the civilian volunteers, Old Thomas had proven surprisingly effective as a coordinator. The elderly farmer organized supply lines with the efficiency of a seasoned quartermaster, ensuring that food, water, and medical supplies reached every defensive position. His calm demeanor helped steady the nerves of younger volunteers who had never experienced combat before. The Queen moved through the palace like an angel of mercy, tending to wounded defenders and providing comfort to those preparing for the next assault. Her medical training, acquired during previous conflicts, proved invaluable as she worked alongside the palace physicians to save lives. Several men owed their survival to her quick thinking and steady hands. Marcus received disturbing intelligence during the lull in fighting. Scout reports indicated that additional rebel forces were approaching from the east, including several units equipped with heavy siege engines. These new arrivals would give General Patterson the firepower needed to breach the palace walls, potentially ending the siege within hours of their arrival. The captain shared this information with his senior officers during a brief strategy meeting in the armory. The mood was grim but determined as they discussed their dwindling options. Colonel Rivera suggested a desperate sortie to destroy the approaching siege engines, while Lieutenant James proposed concentrated fire on General Patterson himself to disrupt rebel command and control. Before any decision could be made, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention to the eastern horizon. Marcus climbed to the highest tower with his spyglass, expecting to see the rebel reinforcements that would seal their fate. Instead, what he saw filled his heart with desperate hope and renewed determination to continue the fight. A dust cloud on the distant road marked the approach of another military force. But these soldiers flew different banners. The blue and silver colors of the Royal Marines appeared through the haze, accompanied by the green standards of the Highland Regiment. These were units that had remained loyal to the crown, and they were racing toward the palace at full speed. Colonel Sarah Mitchell led the Marine column with the same fierce determination that had made her famous throughout the kingdom. Her forces had been stationed in the northern provinces when word of the rebellion reached them. Without hesitation, she had ordered an immediate march to defend the king, pushing her men to their limits to arrive in time. Behind the Marines came Captain Douglas MacLeod's Highland Regiment, their distinctive kilts and war cries announcing their arrival long before they could be seen clearly. These mountain warriors had a legendary reputation for loyalty to the crown, and their presence on the battlefield would significantly alter the balance of power. General Patterson found himself caught between two forces, as the loyal troops approached his rear positions. His numerical advantage was rapidly disappearing, and his carefully planned siege was becoming a complex battle involving multiple armies. The rebels' confidence began to waver, as they realized their easy victory was turning into a desperate struggle. Marcus ordered his defenders to prepare for a coordinated assault, timing their attack to coincide with the arrival of the loyal reinforcements. The palace gates were thrown open for the first time since the siege began, and the royal guard prepared to join their brothers in arms in open battle against the rebellious forces. The king himself donned armor and took up his ceremonial sword, declaring his intention to lead the charge personally. Marcus protested vehemently, pointing out that the monarch's death would end all hope of victory regardless of the battle's outcome. But King Edward's mind was made up, and his presence among the charging troops would inspire every loyal soldier on the field. The three forces converged in the palace plaza with a thunderous crash that shook the ground beneath their feet. Royal guards fought alongside Marines and Highland warriors, their combined assault crushing the rebels' front lines and driving them back in confusion. The sight of their king fighting beside common soldiers created a surge of inspiration that swept through the loyal ranks. General Patterson attempted to rally his forces by personally leading a counterattack against the palace gates. His bravery was undeniable, but his cause was hopeless as loyal forces pressed him from all sides. The rebels found themselves fighting a three-front battle against enemies who shared an unbreakable bond of loyalty to their rightful king. The civilian volunteers played a crucial role in the expanded battle, serving as runners and medical personnel while staying clear of the main fighting. Thomas coordinated their efforts with military precision, ensuring that wounded soldiers from all loyal units received care regardless of which regiment they served. As the afternoon wore on, the tide of battle turned decisively in favor of the crown. Rebel units began surrendering in large numbers, their morale broken by the arrival of overwhelming loyal forces. General Patterson's grand rebellion was collapsing, as his soldiers realized they were fighting a losing battle against their own brothers. The climax came when Colonel Mitchell's Marines broke through the rebel center, dividing their forces and making coordinated resistance impossible. Highland warriors swept around the flanks while the royal guard pushed forward from the palace, creating a trap from which few rebels could escape. Marcus watched the victory unfold with a mixture of relief and sadness. The kingdom had been saved, but at a terrible cost in blood and broken friendships. The sight of General Patterson's forces in full retreat marked the end of the nobles' military rebellion. But Marcus knew that the underlying tensions that had caused this conflict would take much longer to resolve. King Edward stood among his victorious troops, his armor dented and his sword bloodied but his spirit unbroken. The monarch's presence on the battlefield had proven to all who witnessed it that some things were worth fighting for, and that true leadership meant standing with one's people in their darkest hours. The palace courtyard filled with celebrating soldiers as the last rebels fled or surrendered. But even in victory, Marcus remained vigilant, knowing that desperate men might still attempt assassination or sabotage. The captain's duty was far from over, even though the immediate crisis had passed. The aftermath of victory brought new challenges that tested Marcus's leadership in ways he had never imagined. The palace courtyard was filled with wounded soldiers from all three loyal units, their groans and cries creating a symphony of pain that echoed off the ancient stone walls. Medical supplies were running dangerously low, and every available space had been converted into a makeshift hospital. Colonel Sarah Mitchell approached Marcus with a grim expression, her Marine uniform torn and stained with the blood of battle. Her report was sobering. While the immediate military threat had been neutralized, intelligence suggested that several high-ranking nobles had escaped the capital with significant financial resources. These fugitive aristocrats would likely attempt to organize resistance from neighboring kingdoms or hire foreign mercenaries to continue their rebellion. The Queen had transformed the grand ballroom into a medical facility, working tirelessly alongside volunteer physicians and nurses who had emerged from the city's population. Her royal gown had been exchanged for practical clothing more suitable for medical work, and her hands were stained with the blood of men she had helped save. The sight of their queen caring for common soldiers created a powerful symbol of unity that spread throughout the kingdom. King Edward spent the evening visiting wounded defenders, personally thanking each man for his service and sacrifice. The monarch's presence had a remarkable effect on the injured soldiers. many of whom had never expected to speak directly with their king. Their faces lit up despite their pain as Edward listened to their stories and promised that their sacrifices would not be forgotten. Marcus found himself dealing with hundreds of prisoners from the defeated rebel army. Many were common soldiers who had been deceived by their officers or coerced into joining the rebellion through threats against their families. The captain faced the difficult task of distinguishing between willing traitors and victims of circumstance, knowing that justice required different treatment for each group. The civilian volunteers who had supported the defense continued their service in the aftermath, helping to clear debris and assist with medical care. Old Thomas had organized them into efficient work teams, and their contribution to the recovery effort was invaluable. These ordinary citizens had proven that loyalty and courage were not limited to professional soldiers. As night fell over the capital, reports arrived of celebrations breaking out throughout the kingdom as news of the victory spread. Villages that had supported the king's reforms lit bonfires and held festivals, while communities that had remained neutral breathed sighs of relief that the conflict had ended without spreading to their regions. Captain Douglas MacLeod of the Highland Regiment brought disturbing intelligence gathered from interrogated prisoners. The noble rebellion had been part of a larger conspiracy involving foreign powers, who sought to destabilize the kingdom for their own purposes. Gold from neighboring monarchies had funded the rebellion, and promises of territorial concessions had been made in exchange for military support. Marcus realized that the kingdom's troubles were far from over. While the immediate military threat had been defeated, the underlying economic and political tensions that had sparked the rebellion remained unresolved. The nobles who had escaped would likely continue their efforts to undermine the king's authority through other means, possibly including assassination attempts or sabotage of the new reform programs. The king called an emergency council meeting in his private study, bringing together Marcus, Colonel Mitchell, Captain MacLeod, and several trusted advisors. The discussion focused on immediate security concerns and long-term strategies for preventing future rebellions. Everyone agreed that swift action was needed to implement the promised reforms before opposition forces could reorganize. Intelligence reports indicated that Lord Rothwell and Duke Harrison had fled to the neighboring kingdom of Valdres, where they were reportedly meeting with officials who had opposed King Edward's progressive policies. These foreign nobles viewed the reforms as a dangerous precedent that might inspire similar movements in their own territories, making them natural allies for the escaped conspirators. Marcus proposed establishing a new intelligence network to monitor the activities of the escaped nobles and their foreign supporters. The existing system had failed to detect the extent of the conspiracy, suggesting that radical changes were needed in how the kingdom gathered and analyzed information about potential threats. The Queen joined the council meeting to report on the medical situation and the mood among the people. Her work in the makeshift hospital had given her unique insights into the feelings of common soldiers and civilians. Most were supportive of the king's reforms, but many worried about economic retaliation from the noble families who still controlled significant portions of the kingdom's commerce and industry. Colonel Mitchell raised concerns about the loyalty of military units that had not participated in the recent battle. While many had remained neutral rather than actively supporting the rebellion, their future allegiance was uncertain. A thorough review of the entire military structure would be necessary to identify and remove officers who might pose future threats to the crown. The discussion turned to the treatment of captured rebels and their supporters. King Edward's natural inclination toward mercy conflicted with the practical need to deter future rebellions. The council debated various approaches, from public executions that would send a strong message to amnesty programs that might encourage reconciliation. Marcus argued for a balanced approach that would distinguish between leaders and followers, showing mercy to those who had been misled, while ensuring that the architects of the rebellion faced appropriate consequences. The king agreed, recognizing that excessive harshness might create martyrs while excessive leniency might encourage future attempts at revolution. As the night progressed, reports arrived of unrest in several provincial cities, where noble influence remained strong. Local authorities were struggling to maintain order, as rumors spread about the rebellion's failure and the king's determination to proceed with his reforms. Some areas reported attacks on known supporters of the crown, while others saw celebrations that occasionally turned into riots. The Highland Regiment was dispatched to the most troubled regions, their reputation for both loyalty and effectiveness making them ideal for restoring order without appearing to favor either side in local disputes. Captain MacLeod's men had experience dealing with clan conflicts in their mountain homeland, skills that would prove valuable in managing the complex political situations they would encounter. Marcus spent the remainder of the night coordinating security arrangements for the coming days. The king was scheduled to address the nation, officially announcing both the defeat of the rebellion and his commitment to proceeding with the promised reforms. This speech would be a crucial moment that could either unite the kingdom or trigger further unrest. The captain's biggest concern was the possibility of assassination attempts during the public address. The escaped nobles had demonstrated their willingness to use violence, and foreign agents might see the king's death as the easiest way to destabilize the kingdom. Every possible security measure would be implemented, but Marcus knew that determined assassins could sometimes succeed despite the best precautions. Dawn brought new challenges as the full extent of the conspiracy began to emerge through interrogations and document analysis. The rebellion had been planned for months, with coordination extending far beyond the kingdom's borders. Financial records showed payments from foreign sources, and coded messages revealed ongoing plots that extended well beyond the military assault on the palace. The discovery of foreign involvement transformed the situation from a domestic rebellion into an international crisis. King Edward would need to address not only his own people, but also foreign governments that had supported the conspiracy. The diplomatic implications were staggering, potentially affecting trade relationships and military alliances throughout the region. Marcus found himself at the center of preparations for what promised to be the most challenging period of his career. The physical battle had been won, but the struggle for the kingdom's future was just beginning. Every decision made in the coming days would have consequences that extended far beyond the palace walls, affecting millions of people throughout the realm and beyond. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as Marcus received the most shocking intelligence of his entire career. A coded message intercepted from enemy communications revealed that the military intervention they had just defeated was merely the opening move in a much larger conspiracy. The real threat was still coming, and it would arrive within the next 5 minutes. Lieutenant James burst into the command center, his face pale with terror as he delivered the devastating news. A regiment of elite foreign mercenaries, hired and equipped by the escaped nobles, had infiltrated the capital city during the night. These were not ordinary soldiers but professional killers trained specifically for assassination and urban warfare. The foreign regiment had disguised themselves as merchants and refugees, fleeing the recent battle. Their weapons and equipment had been smuggled into the city over several days, hidden in supply wagons and merchant carts that had passed through security checkpoints without suspicion. The level of planning and coordination required for such an operation indicated involvement by foreign intelligence services. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as he realized the implications. While his men celebrated their victory and tended to their wounds, a fresh and far more dangerous enemy was already in position to strike. The palace defenses had been designed to repel external attacks, not to deal with enemies who had already penetrated the city's outer perimeters. The intercepted message contained specific details about the mercenaries' mission. Their primary target was King Edward himself, but they had also been ordered to eliminate key military leaders and destroy the palace's administrative records. The goal was not just regicide, but the complete destruction of the kingdom's governmental structure. Colonel Mitchell was immediately summoned to the emergency briefing, her Marine training in urban combat, making her expertise crucial for the developing situation. Her assessment was grim. If the intelligence was accurate, the mercenaries would likely attack simultaneously from multiple directions, using the element of surprise to overcome the defenders' numerical advantages. The palace's internal alarm system activated for the second time in 2 days, but this warning carried a different tone of urgency. Guards who had been celebrating victory just hours earlier found themselves racing to new defensive positions, their faces showing the strain of transitioning from triumph to terror in a matter of minutes. King Edward received the news with characteristic calm, though Marcus could see the weariness in his eyes. The monarch had hoped that the previous day's victory would allow him to focus on rebuilding the kingdom, but instead he faced an even more serious threat to his life and throne. The personal nature of this assassination attempt made it far more frightening than the formal military rebellion they had just defeated. The queen was immediately escorted to the palace's most secure chambers. Despite her protests that her place was with the medical teams treating wounded soldiers, Marcus had learned from the previous day's experience that royal safety took precedence over everything else, regardless of the monarch's personal preferences. Intelligence reports indicated that the mercenaries had divided into 3 groups, each targeting a different section of the palace complex. Their knowledge of the building's layout was disturbingly accurate, suggesting that they had received detailed information from someone with intimate knowledge of the royal residence. The possibility of betrayal from within the palace staff added another layer of paranoia to an already desperate situation. Captain MacLeod's Highland Regiment was still deployed in the provincial cities, leaving the palace defense to Marcus's Royal Guard and Colonel Mitchell's Marines. The recent battle had depleted their ammunition and exhausted their men, creating vulnerabilities that professional assassins would certainly exploit. The first sign of the attack came from the palace gardens, where a maintenance worker's scream was cut short by the whistle of a crossbow bolt. Marcus's scouts reported movement among the carefully manicured hedges and flower beds, shadows that moved with the fluid grace of trained killers rather than the clumsy stumbling of amateur infiltrators. Marcus divided his remaining forces into 3 groups to counter the mercenary teams, knowing that spreading his men thin was dangerous but necessary to protect all approaches to the royal chambers. Each group was equipped with signal horns to call for reinforcement if they encountered resistance beyond their capabilities. The second mercenary team struck at the palace's main entrance, where guards exhausted from the previous day's fighting struggled to maintain alertness. The attack came without warning as crossbow bolts flew from concealed positions, followed by black-clad figures who moved through the corridors with deadly efficiency. Lieutenant James led the defense of the eastern wing, where the 3rd mercenary team attempted to reach the royal chambers through a series of service passages known only to palace staff. The young officer's quick thinking and aggressive tactics prevented the assassins from reaching their target, but at a terrible cost in casualties among his men. The battle inside the palace was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his military career. Traditional tactics were useless in the narrow corridors and ornate rooms where every piece of furniture could conceal an enemy or provide cover for a desperate last stand. The fighting was personal and brutal, with no quarter asked or given by either side. Colonel Mitchell's Marines proved invaluable in the close-quarters combat, their training in ship-to-ship fighting translating well to the palace's confined spaces. Her unit's disciplined advance through the main corridor gradually pushed back the professional killers, though progress was measured in feet rather than miles. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the palace as mercenaries attempted to enter through windows that had been considered secure. Marcus realized that these assassins had studied the building far more thoroughly than anyone had imagined, knowing about every potential entry point and escape route. King Edward insisted on taking an active role in his own defense, arming himself with a sword and positioning himself where he could support his guards if the assassins broke through. Marcus assigned his best men to protect the monarch, knowing that losing the king would mean the failure of everything they had fought for. The queen's medical skills proved crucial as wounded guards were brought to the secure chambers where she had been placed for safety. Her ability to treat injuries and keep men fighting despite their wounds made a significant difference in the palace's ability to maintain its defense against the professional killers. The turning point came when Marcus personally led a counterattack against the mercenaries in the garden. His knowledge of the palace grounds gave him a crucial advantage as he outmaneuvered the assassins and trapped them in a courtyard, where his superior numbers could be brought to bear effectively. The final mercenary team made a desperate assault on the throne room, believing that they could complete their mission by killing the king in the seat of his power. But they found the chamber empty except for Marcus and a handful of his most trusted guards, who had anticipated this symbolic target and prepared a deadly trap. The mercenaries' leader, a scarred veteran with cold eyes and expensive equipment, realized too late that they had been outmaneuvered. His team found themselves caught in a crossfire between guards, positioned behind the throne and additional forces that emerged from concealed positions. among the ornate pillars that supported the great hall's vaulted ceiling. The battle for the throne room was fierce but brief. These professional killers fought with the desperation of men who knew that failure meant death. But they were facing opponents who fought for something greater than money. Marcus's guards had the advantage of fighting for their homes, their families, and their beloved king. As the last mercenary fell, silence descended over the palace like a heavy blanket. The sound of steel against steel was replaced by the groans of wounded men and the distant calls of guards securing the remaining areas of the complex. Marcus stood among the bodies of his enemies, his sword dripping with blood and his heart heavy with the knowledge of how close they had come to disaster. The aftermath revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had nearly succeeded. Documents found on the mercenary leader showed detailed plans for the kingdom's occupation by foreign forces, with the escaped nobles promised positions as puppet rulers under foreign control. The assassination attempt had been designed to eliminate resistance before a full-scale invasion could begin. Intelligence reports confirmed Marcus's worst fears. Military forces from neighboring kingdoms were already moving toward the border, waiting for news of the king's death before launching their attack. The failure of the assassination mission would force them to either retreat or commit to open warfare against a kingdom that was now fully alert to their intentions. King Edward emerged from the secure chambers where he had waited during the final battle, his face showing both relief and determination. The monarch had survived 2 attempts on his life in as many days, but rather than being intimidated, he seemed strengthened by the knowledge that his enemies feared his reforms enough to risk everything to stop them. The arrival of regular military forces changed everything in ways that Marcus could never have anticipated. As Captain MacLeod's Highland Regiment approached the palace gates, they were joined by columns of soldiers wearing unfamiliar uniforms that initially caused alarm among the exhausted defenders. However, these new arrivals proved to be reinforcements from allied kingdoms who had witnessed the foreign conspiracy and decided to support King Edward's rightful rule. General Amanda Harrison, commander of the Allied forces, brought news that transformed the entire situation. Her intelligence network had intercepted communications revealing that the escaped nobles had made promises to foreign powers that included territorial concessions and trade agreements that would effectively end the kingdom's independence. This information had convinced neighboring monarchs that the conspiracy threatened regional stability. Marcus found himself coordinating with military leaders from 3 different kingdoms as they prepared to face the approaching invasion force. The cultural and linguistic differences presented challenges, but the shared commitment to preventing foreign domination created a bond that transcended national boundaries. The palace became the center of an international alliance formed in response to the nobles' betrayal. King Edward addressed the combined forces from the palace balcony, his voice carrying across the assembled troops with remarkable strength, despite the exhaustion visible in his face. The monarch spoke of the principles that united them all, the belief that people should be governed by their own chosen leaders rather than foreign puppets, and the conviction that justice was worth defending regardless of the personal cost. The Queen had organized the palace's medical facilities to handle casualties from multiple armies, her diplomatic skills proving as valuable as her medical training. Representatives from each allied force worked together under her coordination, creating a model of international cooperation that impressed even the most experienced military leaders. Intelligence reports brought disturbing news about the approaching invasion force. The enemy army numbered nearly 10,000 men, including elite units from multiple foreign kingdoms and a substantial force of hired mercenaries equipped with the latest military technology. Their artillery was particularly formidable, with siege engines capable of breaching even the strongest fortifications. Marcus realized that defending the palace would be impossible against such overwhelming force. Instead, the Allied commanders developed a strategy based on mobility and local knowledge, using the kingdom's terrain to their advantage, while avoiding direct confrontations that would favor the numerically superior enemy. The civilian population played a crucial role in the new defensive strategy. Old Thomas had organized networks of volunteers throughout the capital and surrounding areas, creating an intelligence system that could track enemy movements and provide early warning of attacks. These ordinary citizens had become the eyes and ears of the resistance, Captain McLeod's Highland Regiment was assigned to harass the enemy's supply lines, using guerrilla tactics learned in their mountain homeland to disrupt the invasion force's logistics. Their knowledge of irregular warfare proved invaluable as they taught other units how to strike quickly and disappear before the enemy could respond effectively. Colonel Mitchell's Marines were tasked with securing the kingdom's ports and preventing additional enemy forces from landing along the coast. Her unit's expertise in amphibious operations made them ideal for this mission, and their success would be crucial in preventing the invasion from spreading beyond its current scope. The Allied strategy required King Edward to leave the palace and establish a mobile command center that could coordinate resistance efforts throughout the kingdom. Marcus struggled with the decision to abandon the royal residence, but he recognized that defending a fixed position against overwhelming odds would likely result in total defeat. The evacuation of the palace was conducted with military precision, but it still felt like a defeat to many of the defenders who had sacrificed so much to protect the royal residence. Valuable documents and treasures were removed to secure locations, while the building itself was prepared for potential destruction rather than allow it to fall into enemy hands. As the royal party departed through the palace's hidden passages, Marcus took one last look at the building he had protected for so many years. The ancient stones had witnessed triumph and tragedy, victory and defeat, but they had always represented the continuity of the kingdom's rightful government. Abandoning them felt like abandoning everything he had sworn to defend. The countryside proved to be the kingdom's greatest asset in the struggle against foreign occupation. Villages that had initially remained neutral in the conflict between king and nobles rallied to support their monarch when faced with foreign invaders. The enemy's harsh treatment of civilians created widespread resentment that translated into active resistance. King Edward's mobile court established itself in a series of fortified positions throughout the kingdom, never staying in one location long enough for the enemy to organize an effective attack. This strategy frustrated the invasion force, which had expected to achieve victory through a single, decisive battle rather than an extended campaign. The turning point came when intercepted enemy communications revealed growing discord among the foreign alliance. Some kingdoms had joined the invasion reluctantly, motivated more by fear of their neighbors than by genuine support for the conspiracy. As casualties mounted and the campaign dragged on, these reluctant allies began to question their involvement. Marcus coordinated a series of simultaneous attacks on enemy positions throughout the kingdom, demonstrating that the resistance remained strong despite being forced from the capital. These coordinated strikes required precise timing and communication across vast distances, showcasing the effectiveness of the volunteer intelligence network that had developed. The Queen's diplomatic skills proved crucial in maintaining the international alliance supporting King Edward. Her personal meetings with foreign representatives helped strengthen commitments and coordinate strategy among kingdoms that had little experience working together. Her presence provided a human face for the resistance that countered enemy propaganda about royal tyranny. The final confrontation came not through a massive battle, but through a series of smaller engagements that gradually wore down the enemy's will to continue fighting. As Allied forces won victory after victory, the invasion force began to fragment as different national contingents pursued their own objectives rather than maintaining unity. Lord Rothwell and Duke Harrison, the architects of the original conspiracy, were finally captured during a failed attempt to escape to a neutral kingdom. Their trials revealed the full extent of the foreign plot and provided evidence that helped justify the kingdom's resistance to its own people and to international observers. The restoration of King Edward to his throne was celebrated throughout the kingdom and beyond. The successful resistance to foreign invasion had demonstrated the strength that came from a government that truly served its people's interests, rather than merely pursuing power for its own sake. Marcus stood once again at his post outside the palace gates, his uniform bearing new decorations earned through the recent conflicts. The scars on the building's walls served as permanent reminders of the price paid for freedom. While the reforms that had sparked the original crisis were finally implemented with widespread support from a population united by their shared struggle, the captain's greatest satisfaction came from watching the kingdom's children attend the new schools built with funds recovered from the failed conspiracy. These young people would grow up in a society where opportunity was based on merit rather than birth, where justice was available to all, rather than just the wealthy and powerful. The threat of foreign domination had been defeated, but Marcus knew that vigilance would always be necessary to protect the freedoms that had been won through such sacrifice. The Royal Guard would continue its mission of protecting not just the monarchy, but the principles of justice and equality that the crown now represented. As the sun set over the kingdom, painting the palace walls in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus reflected on the events that had transformed a simple conflict over domestic policy into an international struggle for independence and self-determination. The victory belonged not just to the king or his guards, but to every citizen who had chosen to stand for what was right when faced with overwhelming odds.